Hello and welcome. You're watching the Times of India, and the unthinkable has happened. By voting to leave the European Union, Great Britain has officially decided to turn into what some would say is Little England. This arguably is the greatest big game-changing event globally since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of communism. And to discuss why this is true is with me here Sanjeev Shankaran of the Times of India, who's been tracking this event very closely. Sanjeev, this is huge not just for the UK but for the EU and for India and for the larger global economy. The biggest event since the fall of the Berlin Wall as far as the global economic and political order is concerned. Why is this so big?
We'll start with Berlin Wall because the fall of Berlin Wall symbolized the end of communism in Europe. It meant a change in the world order. It meant that maps were redrawn in Europe, new countries came into being, some of them parted amicably, sometimes, like in the case of the former Yugoslavia, there was bloodshed.
Yeah.
And it meant a change in the way people approached economic policy. So it was probably the single most important event after the Second World War. Now, what's happened since then is UK, which is one of the more important constituents of the European Union, has decided to leave.
Yeah.
In a referendum, they voted to leave. Now, that in turn has triggered a lot of jubilation among some parties in Europe, in different countries of Europe, who also feel that they should have a referendum in their countries.
Sanjeev, if I can just stop you there for a second, just quickly, if we can quickly wrap up first what the numbers of Brexit are, and then we'll go into the impact. This is how the vote looks currently. Well, it's been declared. It's almost 52% of Britain has voted to leave the EU, 48% to remain. Now, this is, irrespective of this result, this is an extremely divided country, isn't it, Sanjeev?
It is, because this was a very bitter campaign, and if you notice, it is not an overwhelming majority that wants to leave. And by UK standards, it was a very violent campaign in the sense that one parliamentarian actually got shot. And she died, which is very unusual there. So it's probably going to leave the country very divided in more ways than one, not just by the fact that the result is so close. Geographically, UK did not vote in the same pattern.
I just want to show a map. I mean, the yellow portion, the yellow voters are the ones who voted to remain with the EU. The blue ones are the ones who voted to leave. And it's very clear here, if you look at this breakup, the yellow one, that's all Scotland and Northern Ireland.
Yeah, so this is Scotland, and this part represents Northern Ireland. Now, historically, the Scots have not been, they have an independence movement in Scotland. Now, they are very keen on being part of the EU, so there is a possibility that Scotland, eventually events will force Scotland out of the EU.
If I may interrupt, Sanjeev, and just add, Patrick French today was tweeting, RIP Great Britain 1707 to 2016, which is exactly what you're saying, in the sense that this puts the future of the UK itself in a big question mark on it.
Yes, because UK has had a lot of problems with Scotland, in the sense that Scotland has a peaceful independence movement, if you like. Northern Ireland actually had a violent movement till about 20 years ago. Now, so these two parts, which have never been too happy to be a constituent of UK, have decided to vote in a very different manner.
If I may add, Sanjeev, that it's these two parts, and the other part which is also voted overwhelmingly in favour of the EU is London, the city of London. And there is a big debate happening, at least on the online channels we've been tracking in the UK, of whether the city of London should secede as an independent city state. I mean, that's slightly the frivolous side, but the point is that London is one of the great financial centres of the world. And now that if England is going to be deprived of the EU market, then a lot of companies are going to reconsider the point of being in London.
Yes, London's very important for UK in many ways. One, because London contributes a disproportionate amount to the UK's economy. It's a far bigger contributor than its population would suggest. And England's competitive, or UK's competitive advantage has been financial services in relation to the rest of Europe. So being part of EU is very important for London's prosperity and London's growth. Now that option is gone, it really means that London, as a financial centre...
London is really the great financial engine of the UK.
And as a financial centre, London is almost sure to lose its importance in the world.
And there are some figures here, Sanjeev, if I can just point out these figures before we go to the impact on the EU. The big demographic divide between the voters, I mean, if you look at this figure, 64% of those who decided to stay, who voted to stay,
The average age is 21.
Average age is 21, which means they still have 69 years to live with the impact of decisions taken by others. And the 58% who voted to leave were over 65 years of age, which means they may have just got 16, 17 years left to live with the consequences of this decision.
Every survey prior to the vote suggested that an anti-immigrant sentiment has been a very important part of the whole campaign. And the older people are the ones who are more anti-immigrant. The younger people who are more pro-EU are the ones who are more open to the idea of...
Simon Scammer, the author from England, he was writing today that the old have essentially disinherited the young in England by this vote.
Absolutely, because in all probability, UK's economic fortune is going to dip after this one, and the young will have to pay the consequences for it. They've been done in by an earlier generation.
May I also point out the fact that at one level there was this generational divide. At another level, there is this huge schism which this vote has exposed is between the mob, if you like, or the vox populi, and the experts, the establishment, which is a mirror image of what's happening in the US as well, where the establishment, the economists, the scholars, the political class, they have all been discredited, and they've all argued for one particular point of view, which is to remain with the EU, whereas the large the rest of the population has said, well, to hell with you, we're not voting with you. And that's precisely what Donald Trump is talking about as well. He's going to be in Scotland tomorrow.
Yes, and Donald Trump incidentally has welcomed the Brexit or UK leaving European Union. Now, talking about the experts, remember, David Cameron, the Prime Minister, campaigned against the exit. As did the two former Prime Ministers who are still alive, Tony Blair and John Major, and they're from different parties. Despite coming from different parties, the three people in UK who, let's say the former prime ministers have all understood the consequences of an exit, and they've all campaigned on the same line that do not leave.
And I mean, David Cameron, of course, has resigned just a year after his majority last year, which was against all opinion polls. He's lost his prime ministership. Just one more point, Sanjeev, is. Now we've talked about the implications for the UK. What about the implications for Europe? And this is why we are talking about the Berlin Wall point. If you can talk to us a little bit about the domino effect this might have as far as the rest of Europe is concerned.
You remember for the European Union project, which is to really bring Europe closer together, two countries are most important. France and Germany. They're the pillars, they're the foundation on which the entire European Union project rests. Now, France actually has a far-right leader, Le Pen, who feels that France also needs a referendum to find out if they should stay in EU or not. Now, if France is not going to be part of EU, you can be fairly sure EU is going to collapse.
And it's France and Germany, they are the center.
Germany doesn't seem to have that kind of sentiment at the moment, but then there are other parts of the EU. There is Netherlands, again an important part of the EU. Italy.
The Netherlands, if I can interrupt, one of the leaders of the Dutch right today has tweeted and welcomed the vote from Britain, saying it's now our turn. We must now have the same vote.
So the common thread running through these parties is most of them are far right parties. Most of them have a very strong anti-immigrant platform, and they all want to be out of EU, as in they want to go it on their own or do it on their own. They want to go alone, and it's very likely that other countries
through this map. I mean, this is a map put together by the TOI's people who are tracking this. Scotland, maybe fresh calls for independence in the UK, may lead up to a further breakup of the UK. Ireland, you have a problem again. There'll be a surge in anti-EU forces in Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and Netherlands. There's already huge disenchantment with the EU and Poland and Hungary on the immigrant question. Greece, if the EU falls apart, Greece is going to fall apart. It's essentially on a drip feed of funds from the EU.
Greece actually needs EU, right? Because Greece is going through a terrible economic dislocation, and if EU comes apart at the seams, then Greece gets very badly affected. So the Greeks must be hoping that EU will hold together.
The point is, Sanjeev, that the European Union, since the last 30 years, certainly since the end of the Second World War to begin with, and then especially over the last 30 to 40 years, has been a bulwark of the global economy. Now, if there's going to be a domino effect with the UK leaving the EU, if the EU falls apart, it changes global politics as we know it completely.
It changes global politics completely. It changes, the kind of economic dynamism that's there in the world completely. It's very difficult to predict how a new order will shape up because EU, if you just step back for a second, EU, despite all its shortcomings, actually represents, let's say, a shift of
post-national world, a world of great economic growth, all the greater things in humanity.
Yeah, they tend to champion human rights and so on. They've been inconsistent there, but the fact is, they more than others, they probably tend to push for these values.
Yeah. If we can move forward, Sanjeev, I mean, David Cameron, of course, has resigned. But look at Nigel Farage, one of the great victors of today from the UKIP party. He's saying, thanks to all, we can now dream of an Independence Day. Well, how ironic. 60 years after the left India.
He says we've got our country back, but very likely his country is not going to be together a year from now or 2 years from now. So I'm not sure which country he's got back.
Also, I think, a lot of the guys who've supported the Leave decision, they're arguing that UK will now, like Ian Botham you were mentioning before we started, they've been arguing UK will become great again. It's almost like a Donald Trump saying on the other side, vote me and I'll make you great again. And of course, the UK is still the 5th biggest economy in the world, I think, the 5th biggest defense spender and so on. But without the power of the EU market, and at a time when labour rates in the UK are so high, it's just going to be a small island.
Yeah, UK without EU, without the advantage of being a stepping stone to EU, is no longer as attractive for other countries that want to deal with it.
Yeah.
So on its own, UK is simply not as attractive.
So let's look at, this is why the global markets have been, if you can talk us through, Sanjeev, a little bit about how the global markets have reacted. I understand some $3 trillion worth of dollars have been wiped out in today's trades around the world.
That's right. So what's happened is, I think it would appear that a lot of markets did not expect this verdict. And they seem to have been taken by surprise, or they were shocked. Now, in the case of the British pound, it's almost a given now that unless people have read things very wrong, UK is economically not going to be as strong as it was or as it is today. So the pound has fallen to its lowest level in more than 3 decades against the US dollar.
Since 1985.
Yeah. Now,
since Margaret Thatcher, really.
Since early days of Margaret Thatcher, because then she continued as a prime minister much longer. Partly this.
Just look at how the pound just goes across the.
Now, partly this trend could have been a little exaggerated because when there's so much of uncertainty, money flocks to a safe haven. The US dollar is regarded as one of the safe places to park your money in times of uncertainty. Take gold, for instance. Gold is something that people invest in when there's a lot of risk, when you're unsure of the future, then a lot of money goes into gold. Look at the rise in gold price. It means that people have just flocked to gold today because they see a lot of uncertainty ahead.
Also in terms of, if I'm not wrong, all global markets, the Nikkei, they had to bring in circuit breakers today because they've really gone down. And now what about the impact on the Nifty? The Nifty crashed, but I think there's been some recovery before the close of markets today.
India can't be really immune to something as big as this. While relatively speaking, our economy is much better placed than many other countries. And that's exactly what the Finance Minister, Mr. Arun Jaitley, said today. But you can't, we're closely integrated with the rest of the world. We just can't be immune to the problems there because the problems there come to India through a couple of channels. Right? For instance, Mr. Jaitley said, as investors look around the world for safe havens. Typically, India is not a safe haven. Why? Because emerging markets such as India and a few other markets are seen as the riskier markets.
So he said, as investors look around the world for safe havens in these turbulent times, India stands out both in terms of stability and of growth. He also added, the Indian economy is well prepared to deal with the short and medium-term consequences of Brexit. It's not just Mr. Jaitley, Raghuram Rajan, who is going to be relinquishing charge as the RBI governor in September. He's also pitched in. He said the Indian economy has good fundamentals, low short-term external debt, and sizable foreign reserves. These should stand the country in good stead in the days to come. So I think the RBI, of course, will take necessary steps, including liquidity support and so on. So, the powers that be, the Indian government moving fast to sort of stem the panic, if you like.
Also because this was an anticipated event. Nobody knew what the outcome of the result would be, but they were prepared.
But they would have had their plans in place.
Despite your best plans, if there is a problem in the rest of the world, it kind of it transmits itself into India through financial markets, because these markets are linked. Investors are common to many countries. Now, if they feel that there's a lot of uncertainty, let's reallocate our money from country X to Y, we'll move to a safer country, very likely it will affect India. It's not possible.
Sanjeev, let me ask you a question which a lot of people who've been part of the discussion, they've been asking this question. And this is certainly one of the, I've been reading a lot of articles in the last 5-6 days saying, let's hope that Britain votes to leave. It'll be good for India. There's this argument that if they don't want Polish plumbers, then they might want Odia plumbers. But to put it very bluntly and very crudely. How much credence do you give to arguments like these?
I'm skeptical about this line of argument because, as we just mentioned a while ago, an anti-immigrant sentiment was part of the reason why there was a Brexit referendum, why it went the way it did. Now, it's very unlikely if they're unhappy with European immigrants, they're going to be happy with Asian immigrants.
Absolutely.
I don't think they're going to make it easy for Asian immigrants, though a lot of people feel that this opens up doors for Indians. Will it? Because if UK is not going to do financially or as well as it did, then it's very likely that they're not going to allow too many people to come.
Ultimately, the immigrant issue was the sort of central fault line on which the Brexit vote was fought.
It could appear it was the central fault line.
And this is why I think this, as we said at the beginning of this broadcast, this is equivalent to another Berlin Wall, at least metaphorically. But this is going to change the world as we know it, and it has huge consequences for the UK, for the EU, for the global economy, and for us as well.
Yes, with a difference. The Berlin Wall, when it came down, it did change the world, but it represented a move towards being more open. Let's use
Francis Fukuyama talked about the end of history.
Berlin Wall meant a little. When you think back, the fall of Berlin Wall meant a little more openness, whereas Brexit is being driven by a tendency to look inward, to be deeply suspicious of someone you can't really identify with, and it's something that's spreading across Europe. In US, Donald Trump represents that sentiment in the US. He's completely overturned at least conventional wisdom in the US. So it is the equivalent of a Berlin Wall, but with a very gloomy difference.
It's the exact opposite. I mean, it's in terms of impact, it's similar, but its import is, instead of being positive, is completely on the negative side. So on that note, on that somber note, we'll stop here. Keep watching the Times of India for live updates.